Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us again this evening on the show Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Before we go on, I'd want to thank you all for all your contributions over the last few months. We've been running this show, all the comments we've received online, the comments on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We appreciate you. We thank you for the time that you are putting in to listen to the views of the professor here on various international issues. Today promises to be a great time and no exception to what we have been experiencing from the wisdom that the professor has exhibited on this program in the way he has answered a lot of the questions that you have put forward. As of last week, these broadcasts are now being viewed at over 30 nations of the world. We thank you for your contribution. We thank you for helping to share that message. And for those who are on Facebook, you can, please, it's an interactive session. You can ask your questions on Facebook across the different pages on Facebook. You can also ask questions on YouTube. We'll do our best to get all those questions on board. And if we don't get to your question this week, we may get to the question next week as we start the show. Professor, you are welcome to the show this evening again. Thank you for being here with us and for making the time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Before we go on, there was a question we didn't get to last week from one of the viewers on YouTube. And that was this. It says, you are the Director General of Nigeria's think tank on foreign policy, where you led bilateral relations with countries around the world, including China. What was your position on China then, and has it changed now?
No, my views have not changed. The series of interactions, which I labeled dialogue at that time, was predicated on the fact that Nigeria was too important not to talk to different countries in the world, especially the big powers, and that it was not enough for us to leave the interaction to simply the embassies and the diplomatic staff, but that intellectuals, or what I call the foreign policy elite of one country, should be able to interact with the foreign policy of another country, the foreign policy elite of another country, so that while government benefits from the views on government-to-government basis, the country itself will benefit from interaction between foreign policy elite. So not only did we talk to the Chinese, we talked to the Americans, we talked to the Russians, we talked to the French, we talk to different important countries. So even right now, I'm still of the view that people should talk to people, that the foreign policy elite in each country should talk to the foreign policy elite in another country. And let me tell you something which you gain from such interaction, which was very educative to me. We had gone to China, and of course, typically in this kind of interaction, we were sitting on one side of the table, the Chinese delegation was sitting on the other side of the table. Since I was leading the Nigerian delegation, I sat at the head of the table, and I assume that the person facing me on the Chinese side was the head of the Chinese delegation. That's how it was introduced in any case. And our interaction and debate went on back and forth until it got to the point. And this was the third day when we were drawing up the terms of the communique. And we had disagreements. The Chinese had prepared a draft communique, which they just wanted us, the Nigerian side, to sign on to. Now, this was at a period, we are talking about the 70s now, when the Chinese were only used to liberation movements, sending delegations to China. And since this, delegations were usually supplicants. We want this from China. We want China to do this for us. It was easy for the Chinese to say, fine, we will do all those things. You just sign this document as our joint communique. When they tried it with Nigeria, they were shocked when we said, no, we are not accepting this. They were not used to a delegation of Africans saying no to them. They didn't really know how to cope with that. So they said, well, if we will not sign, that will be the end of the conference. And they were shocked when I said, fine, that will be the end of the conference. We will leave without signing any agreement. And then the last man on the Chinese side, who was sitting at the tail end of the table, who has said nothing all throughout the 3 days, simply said, the Nigerian side is actually correct.
Wow.
The community should reflect the views of both the Nigerian side and the Chinese side. And that was when it struck me that that was the most important Chinese man in the room. And yet he was sitting at the tail end of the table and he hadn't said a word. Of course, once he said that, the Chinese side flipped and now agreed for us to start the terms of the communique starting afresh. So two things had happened there.
Wow.
The Chinese had met a totally different type of Africans that they hadn't had to deal with before. And I, the Nigerian side, had also learned that in China, what you see is not necessarily what you get.
Wow, that should be a big lesson for a lot of our viewers here. I think just listening to that story, it's a tip in negotiations. Don't always assume the person in front of you holds the power.
Yeah.
That is amazing. Well, while we're still on this China point, earlier on this week, the executive director of the International Trade Center gave a speech, effectively talking about China helping the industrialization of Africa and giving China the nod for doing that. But there are a lot of African voices that are starting to challenge the way in which African nations, and Nigeria as well, included in that, are taking loans from China. And they're asking the question, is it worth it? Are we mortgaging the future of Africa? And is this the beginning of another form of colonization? What are your views there?
Well, there are several things you've wrapped into your presentation. The first thing is, there is absolutely nothing wrong with Africa broadening the basis of its interaction with the economic global community. rather than just being dependent on one source alone. Yes, it makes sense for us to have many trading and many economic partners. So that we should get out of the way. The second then is the terms of the engagement. The terms of the engagement. And a lot of Africans have been worried about the content of the agreement that their countries or our countries have been signing with China. You should separate this issue from the propaganda we are getting from the West, that we should have nothing to do with China. We should be afraid of Chinese domination. We should be afraid of getting China involved too deeply into African affairs. They are simply trying to protect their own trading relationship with Africa. However, the terms of the agreement, we must look very closely into those terms. Number one, African countries or African governments should not sign agreements that they know they cannot operate, that will not be in their interest, that at the end of the day they will not be able to repay the terms of the agreement. It doesn't make sense for you to sign an agreement where the Chinese promise to give you yuan, their own currency, but you pay back in dollars. Now that is an unequal terms of agreement. You shouldn't. Number two, look at the project itself. Will you be able to, will this project be in your favor in the future? What is the point of signing an agreement for Chinese to build a railway system, which you would then have to pay off the terms over, let's say, 20 years, when the volume of people traveling by the railroad system in your country cannot sustain the railway system? If it will sustain the railway system, if the income that will be generated will be of such magnitude that you can pay off that loan, by all means go ahead. But if at the end of the day you are going to be asking for restructuring, you are going to be asking for the terms, in other words, you will not be able to fulfill the economic terms, then don't go into it. Finally, let us not be emotional about this. There is usually a clause in this agreement which is standard procedure. And the clause usually says country X cannot plead its sovereignty to protect it if there are disagreements, if there are conflicts, and you need to go to arbitration. You cannot say, I am a sovereign country, you cannot drag me before a court of arbitration. That is standard procedure. Economic relations is different from political relations. Political relations, you can plead your sovereignty to protect you. But economic relations, you cannot plead your sovereignty to protect you. There are several cases that I can that I can quote, which had established this principle that in economic relations, sovereignty cannot be pleaded as a cover to prevent you from going to arbitration. And that is really what is usually in that agreement. But this thing is also in our cases. In agreements that we sign with Western countries, there are several cases in British courts involving the interpretation of contract agreements between foreign companies and African governments. And that's nothing. It's a usual procedure. So those are the things that you really need to look into. One, don't sign agreement that you cannot fulfill. Look very carefully. Get your economic experts to look at the terms to make sure that the contracts are not going to lead you into economic slavery.
Wow. So it seems to me that what you're saying is that sometimes there is a bit of an emotive response to Chinese investment, probably from people who may not have seen the detail of the contracts that are being signed.
Yes, we must be careful we don't play into the propaganda hands of people who don't want us to have any relationship with China at all. But at the same time, I'm also saying that China needs to be careful not to force down our throats agreements that are not sustainable. I'm not happy really at the way China behaves towards Africans. But then I'm not happy at the way China behaves towards a lot of countries in the world. China seems to have gone into an aggressive diplomatic stage, and it needs to be careful not to make too many enemies. I think we dealt with this last week.
Yes.
Problem is Hong Kong. You have problem with consulates being closed on both sides. You have problems with COVID-19. You've got to be careful. In fact, you have problem with the Vatican, where it is now being, where the Chinese are being accused of breaking into the code of the Vatican diplomatic communication. You alone, with all these accusations coming in from all sides, something is wrong with Chinese diplomatic profile now. And China needs to take a step back to ensure that it's not fighting too many wars on different sides at the same time.
On the issue of the diplomatic buildings that were being closed, the U.S. closed the consulate in Houston, I think it was. China responded by closing another one in one of their Chinese cities. What do you think the response of the U.S. will be, or is this going to continue to be a bit of a tit for tat on that front?
Well, usually, that's the way diplomacy is played. You close my embassy or my consulate, I close your embassy or your consulate, and then we all take a breather. If there are several consulates, by the way. The Chinese have, I think, 5 consulates in the US, and the US has 5 consulates in China. They've closed one each. So there are still 4 outstanding. The next, it's like playing a game of chess. Next move is up to the United States. But that next move does not have to be closure of another consulate. It could be something else. There are several contact points between China and the United States all over the world, and a button can be pressed at different positions.
All right, let's come home to Africa here. Malawi recently concluded presidential elections in what some have called historic. We see another example of where an opposition coalition has come together, challenged the outcomes of an election, and they won in the courts. So, first of all, is the African light finally starting to shine on free and fair elections? And secondly, the elected president doesn't seem to have a background of someone who has been well versed in government, in politics. And do you see that impacting his ability to be able to govern that nation?
Well, we should be careful that we don't think we have democracy only if the opposition replaces the government of the day. Democracy involves free, fair, transparent elections, and that may lead to the government of the day being returned to power. Now, the emphasis will be on the process. Number two, democracy involves grievances being articulated and aired within a judicial system. That's what has happened in Malawi, but also happened in Kenya, where the courts overturned the presidential elections and they had to have a rerun. But there have been several other cases where the courts upheld the outcome of the elections. I think that we do have a rainbow of democracy in Africa. Governments have changed. It did in Ghana through free and fair elections. It did in Nigeria, and it's obviously done now in Malawi. So we do have a rainbow of democracy shining in Africa, and we should applaud that. The second leg of your question is the behavior, the post-election behavior of the new president. I know people may say, well, give him time. However, I think there have been some discomfort about the kinds of people whom he has appointed as cabinet members, family members, people who are, within his locality, rather than extending the base of the cabinet to include civil society organizations, trade union movements. I mean, these were people who also fought for him. But as you have rightly pointed out, he's inexperienced. This will be his first shot, I believe, at running for government, for office, and he's been lucky that he's got it at the very top. But do recall again something we said, whether last week or week before, about getting experienced people to run for office. I think we were talking about, young people,
Yes.
that old people. And I was pointing out that people who've never been local government councillors or chairmen of local government or senators, all of a sudden just aiming for the president, you may not have that gravitas and the experience needed if you get to that office for governance. Democracy is not just winning election, it's also how you run the government. And I think the new president of Malawi has to keep that in mind.
Okay. And you've touched on it now because Obama was a senator in the U.S. We see a lot of these people who had been in government before then moving on. But apart from the the sort of background that the people come from when they are going for these roles. They're the choice of the people because they've won the elections. Where they do not have the right qualifications, shouldn't there be a process in place to ensure that the right sort of experience is voted into power?
The important thing is to run a free and fair election, and if you win, then you assume office. The second are constitutional provisions. In several African countries, we have clued into the American system where you have a National Assembly or a Senate that vets your appointees for you, especially those going into your cabinet, those going into the Supreme Court, those going into high offices of government. There's a second opportunity for them to be vetted, in the sense that the Senate must then approve this appointment. I'm not particularly conversant with the specific provisions of the Malawian constitution, because there are other countries where once the president makes the appointment, that is it, they go into office. But in order to prevent inexperienced people all of a sudden just being booted into high offices of state, maybe constitutions should have to consider having these provisions of Senate vetting and approving recommendations from the president for cabinet members, Supreme Court judges, and so on and so forth.
Right. While still on Africa, we had this week that an independent panel has finally cleared Akinyemi Adesina of the AFDB of any allegations of favoritism. How do you respond to this?
I'm so happy. I'm really very, very happy. And I must say that I had my fears, I had my doubts at the beginning when they started to talk about this independent panel. And I did say on this program that it was unfair to the African Development Bank and unfair to Adesina to have another panel which was not provided for in the articles of association of the bank. But when that panel was then set up and I saw the caliber of people on that panel, really I went to sleep with my two eyes closed. The chairman was Mrs. Robinson, who was president of Ireland at one time and also had been I think the director of the the United Nations Human Rights Commission, then the Supreme Court Chief Justice of Gambia. And when you look at his credentials, I mean, he had a high profile internationally. And then the third person, even though he had worked with the World Bank, came from South Africa, from the legal and judicial track in South Africa. Then, as I said, I went to bed with my two eyes closed, and I'm happy that I haven't been disappointed. Congratulations to Dr. Adesina. I hope the Americans will not continue to create problems for the African Development Bank, and that they will be gracious enough themselves to accept the report of this panel, which they were instrumental in setting up.
Absolutely. All right. Let's move to
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Mr. Moderator. Please, before we leave this issue, because it has bothered me. This this contraption called whistleblower, even though it was brought and into many several institutions in order to encourage honesty and probity, I think it is now clear that the institution could be abused. The institution of whistleblower could be abused. And I'm recommending, using this platform, I'm recommending that where the whistleblower is found to have been mischievous, he should be dismissed actually from the institution. But where the whistleblower is found to have done the correct thing and his allegations have been upheld, of course, the target of the whistleblowing should also be dismissed from office. If you don't do this, you will find out that most CEOs will not be able to concentrate on their job because they are going to be afraid of some whistleblower coming up from somewhere and making false allegations against them. They will be afraid to discipline people within the organization. They'll be afraid to run the organization as it's supposed to be run. So I hope that this institution of whistleblowing will now be accompanied by a caveat that if the whistleblowing is found to be atrocious, mischievous, false, then the whistleblower will be dismissed from office.
Wow. Wow. All right, let's move to the US. We've seen a few things, quite a few issues going on in the US from in the last week. One of them is where armed black groups have started to become more visible in the streets in the support for black rights in the United States. But then we're seeing a counter offensive, in a sense, from armed white groups, effectively bringing deadly weapons to protests and to protesting in general. Is this worrying for you?
Well, it is not just worrying for me, it should be worrying for the United States and for the rest of the world, because this could easily degenerate into a shootout on the streets of American cities. There was one time when an American commentator said that if the United States was not careful, he could foresee a civil war on the streets of the United States. And some of us felt, well, he was exaggerating, that it is just not possible. But with what you have just referred to, I have my fears that the United States may be heading down a road it didn't plan for. Because all it takes is for one person to let off a shot, and before you know it, there'll be gunfire from all sides. I would like to appeal to the President of the United States to step forward and reduce his rhetoric, because frankly, he is the one who is responsible for this situation, because he has sought to demonize the demonstrators by saying they have been hijacked by radical elements. He had brought into the streets of American cities federal law enforcement agencies, which some of the constitutional lawyers have said were unconstitutional. And therefore, the white groups that you've mentioned may have felt emboldened to come into the street because of the body language and profile of the President of the United States. He could really dampen this development by reducing his own rhetoric, by emphasizing the right of peaceful demonstrators, and that if there's any breakdown in law and order agents constitutionally recognized can deal with the situation, and that it is a disgrace for the United States for you to have this kind of confrontation between racial groups armed to the teeth.
A comment here on Facebook says that we had white groups that came first and that the black groups came in response to the white. But does it really matter who brought arms to the front first in this kind of scenario?
No, it does matter, because the comment on Facebook has just emphasized the point I made, that President Trump should be held responsible for this, because it was his own rhetoric, his own body language, his own views that have brought this. And this is not the first time it will happen. In fact, about 6 months after he got into office, I think it was in Virginia or somewhere, where Nazi white groups came in and some of the demonstrators got killed. And instead of having an outright condemnation of the white groups, the president was saying there are good people on both sides, a view for which he was soundly criticized. So it does matter who is wrong. We shouldn't have this relative morality. There is always a right group and a correct, there's always a right group and a wrong group. And we shouldn't seek to have moral relativity in our judgment.
Okay. Prof, I'm going to take you back to the AFDB issue. There's a comment on YouTube here that says, should Africa have agreed to the American aggression in the first place?
Well, with hindsight, let us praise the wisdom of diplomacy. I don't want to be made to sound anti-American. I studied in the United States. Most of my formative years were in the United States. I have a lot of friends there. I admired John F. Kennedy, whom I met. I admired President Carter. I admired President Clinton. I have some admiration for Barack Obama. But I must say that I fear President Trump, his ability to destroy institutions. If the Africans had said, no, we are not going to have a different panel, it's not beyond him to then decide that he's going to destroy the African Development Bank by any means possible. So, there are times when you are dealing with a bull in a china shop. You may just have to create a situation where you remove, the things that can be broken while the bull is still rampaging around to ensure it doesn't destroy that shop. So now that, he's had his way and Dr. Additional has been cleared, hopefully he will turn his attention to somewhere else.
Okay. There's another question on YouTube, but we'll come back to that in a second. So in the United States, Again, President Trump has ordered the withdrawal of some American troops from Germany to other nations in Europe, including Italy. Do you see this causing a major upset to the dynamics with NATO in the region? First question. And then, do you consider the reason put forward as a justifiable one?
Well, the withdrawal of American troops, which had been a linchpin of the NATO establishment and which had been part of the post-World War strategic European European anti-communist protective shield for Europe, is not well thought out. Today, Putin will be breathing easier that American troops have been moved from Germany further away to other European cities. He will be breathing easier that NATO now has to scramble in coming up with a strategy, a military strategy in confronting Russia that cannot have this strong defense link in Germany. It's not well thought out. It's a problematic position that has been created for Europe and for the Germans. Now, I am aware that President Trump has been very unhappy about the financial contributions of several European countries, including Germany, towards the maintenance of American troops in Europe. He feels that while they have been using their resources to build up their economic base, they have left the United States to carry basically the financial burden of NATO strategy. And it's like, well, it was going to punish the Germans by forcing them to now spend more of their resources on building up their own military posture. All I would say is that he shouldn't forget that maintenance of those troops in NATO had been part of the prop that sustained the position of the United States as a global power. America has benefited from that as well. It's been cheaper keeping them in Europe, keeping them in Germany, than having to fly them all the way from the United States if there are problems with Russia. It really is. It was cheaper. And not only was it cheaper, effectively, it was a better strategy than having to fly them 6 hours from the United States. And therefore, it is counterproductive what has been done. But, well, he's the commander-in-chief, and the Americans elected him the first time. And let me just repeat, I'm not an American, I don't have the vote, but let me then just repeat what the late John Lewis said in his column in New York Times today that is being buried. Vote in November. This is probably the most important election that has ever been held in the United States. In a way, I would disagree with John Lewis on that. I think the election that voted in Abraham Lincoln was the most important election that was held. But I get the point that John Lewis is making.
Okay, so there is some other news that has come out today. Now that you mentioned American election, that President Trump is maybe looking at the possibility of postponing American elections. How do you react to that?
You see, even you are laughing. You are hesitating at even coming up with what the man said. Trouble is sleeping, and you, President Trump is adopting a position to wake up that trouble. He will get 10 times the trouble that is waking up. I cannot believe I'm hearing this. I cannot believe this is in the United States. That the possibility of an election being postponed so that a sitting president can carry on, a president who has proved, I mean, he said this as part of the result against COVID-19, but he's proved ineffective in coping with COVID-19. So you want to benefit from your own inefficiency by coming up with this crack brain idea. I've never heard of this. Even during the American Civil War, they had an election. Abraham Lincoln was re-elected for a second term. So what are we talking about? During the Second World War, we had an American election. So COVID-19 is going to stop an American presidential election. I mean, well,
Prof, let me ask a question this way, Prof. Hypothetically, if that happened, what do you see as happening after that?
No, you cannot ask me a hypothetical question because, first of all, he doesn't have the power to do so. It's going to take 2/3 of the vote of American states to amend the Constitution and to do that. So let's just say he's looking for trouble, more trouble than he'll be able to handle. I hate to say that I foresee involvement or intervention by the American military to restore constitutional government. I hate to say so. This is not the United States that one knows. This is not the United States that one is used to. This is not the democratic country that we know, where we would then sit here and be talking, not just here. I'm sure it's all over the airwaves in the global society, where we'll be talking about the possibility of an American president carrying out a coup, because that is what it will be, a coup d'etat. The United States, I can't believe I'm hearing, I can't believe what I'm hearing. I can't.
Prof, there's a question here on YouTube that says, isn't the issue that America now considers China the clear and present danger and not Russia, is why America is diverting resources away from NATO and to China?
Well, it's not going to China. It's diverting the resources from Germany to other European countries. I mean, if these troops were being moved to Taiwan or Japan or some other Southeast Asian countries, yes, I mean, I will understand perhaps the reasoning behind that question. But let me say this, and this is something which I have said in other places and in delivering other lectures. The most dangerous time for the world is when an upcoming power meets a downcoming power, and they miscalculate as when to mount the challenge. Germany did this during the First World War. It miscalculated. It led to the First World War. It did this, Hitler did this during the Second World War. He miscalculated when he thought Germany was powerful enough to take on the world. That miscalculation led to a Second World War with millions of lives being lost. I just hope that between the United States, which is coming down as a global power, and China, which is going up as a global power, there will be no miscalculation about who is going to challenge who or who is going to confront who militarily. It will be disastrous for the world.
So another question here, which I would take, is if you were still the custodian of Nigeria's foreign policy, how would you respond to Trump in the US and to China of today? I think you've touched on some of the views there, but I just want to put that to you if there is any further comments you would want to make on that.
Well, I think it's not even just the question of I wouldn't localize it that way. What I would do is that, the way I will put it is that the global scene is in such a state of flux now that it enables a medium power like Nigeria to play an activist role. Right now, both the United States and China are looking for allies in their confrontation towards each other. And it behoves medium powers on whose, people, that saying, if the heavens are going to fall, it will fall on the heads of all of us. And if there's a military confrontation between China and the United States, the rest of the world will not be spared. To that extent, a medium power like Nigeria has an opportunity in alliance with other medium powers to try to ensure that that kind of conflagration, which I earlier on scheduled, does not happen.
Another question here, again, going back to a point you already talked about in terms of the recent discovery of the National Assembly that Nigeria signed to waive her sovereignty over her assets both at home and abroad when it comes to payment of loan defaults. I think it's a point that you've already addressed. On this point, we need to look at the details of what was signed, because some of the things that are being talked about are the standard things we would see in commercial agreements. Obviously,
Yes.
we've got issues with other areas. So for the
Yes.
person that asked that question, please, Prof has already answered that, and we will get back. We won't be taking that because there are more questions coming in here that we need to address. But thank you for that question. Please do keep your questions coming in. I'm sure the Prof will be more than happy to answer them. Now, we seem to be running out of time. Let's take one question again. There's this new piece of information coming out that Russia may already have a vaccine for COVID-19. This is something that we haven't heard of before in terms of testing. Suddenly, they've come on the scene to say they have got something.
Well, this news broke yesterday, and the Russians said that they would actually introduce this vaccine in 2 weeks' time. I believe they said August 10th or August 17th. Out of the blue, Now, you know the protocol as well as I do about the introduction of vaccines. There will be stage 1, which will be limited to 20, 50 people. If that is successful, then there will be stage 2, which will be limited to about 3,000 people or so, and then there will be, and if that's successful, there will now be stage 3, where you deal with a larger volume in more countries and then wait to evaluate the report. And each one of these stages is peer reviewed. You make details available so that other scientists can evaluate what you are doing. You don't sneak it on people. I was shocked when I heard this news yesterday, because all of a sudden we are now going to be exposed to this vaccine that we know nothing about, and people are now going to be injecting with this vaccine. The details we don't even know. You know, we've talked about it on this program, that this competition between countries as regards who is going to bring out this vaccine first. There is economic nationalism involved, not just pride, because whoever brings out a vaccine that works first, then billions of people are going to be vaccinated, and that's going to mean a lot of money. Even if they don't charge their own people, the moment they try to sell that vaccine to the rest of the world, there is a lot of money that is going to be made. And it behoves us. I hope the World Health Organization will step in, and perhaps this is where it didn't make sense, again, for United States to have pulled out of the World Health Organization, because somebody now has to step in and say, no, you cannot introduce this vaccine to the rest of the world. If you want to poison your own people, fair enough, although not fair, but all right, but not the rest of the world. But what the Russians said they are going to do, it baffles me, it frightens me, and I think that, again, this is the time for the world powers, heads of states, to get together to say, no, we cannot allow this.
Wow, fantastic. Prof, we have run out of time. There are questions here that we cannot take today. To our viewers, thank you for the questions. Please join us next week. Some of these questions, I think it's important for the Prof to respond to them. We have another breaking point here in terms of the Africa Free Trade Area and the report that's been released this week from the World Bank. We will come to these points next week. We thank you for your time. We thank you for participating in this event, and we'll see you again.